All right, good morning, powerful people. Today is Numbers Day, and welcome to this Workers by the Numbers blogcast presented by the Power at Work blog. I am Alicia Modestino, a professor at Northeastern University and the executive director of Community to Community, a new initiative to promote the use of community-engaged research to make social change. This morning, we're going to talk about the latest job numbers, unemployment, wages, which are hot off the presses from the Bureau of Labor Statistics just 15 minutes ago. And joining me in analyzing the numbers is our expert panel with a lot of experience analyzing these data and bringing these insights to advise policymakers and practitioners about the labor market. First, Dr. Aaron Sojourner, who is a senior researcher at the W.E. Upjohn Institute of Employment Research. He was formerly an associate professor of economics at the University of Minnesota's Carlson School of Management and a senior economist for the Council of Economic Advisors. Hey, Aaron, how are you doing today?
Good, Alicia. How's it going?
Good. Second, Dr. Teresa Ghilarducci, who is the Irene and Bernard L. Schwartz Chair in Economic Policy Analysis in the Economics Department at the New School for Social Research. She also directs the Schwartz Center for Economic Policy Analysis and focuses on economic policy research and outreach. Good morning, Teresa.
Hello, Alicia.
Thank you both for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you. I'm just going to dive right in and do the numbers, so to speak. So here are the headline numbers that were just dropped 15 minutes ago. The unemployment rate held roughly steady at 3.9% in October, ticked up slightly, although this is the highest since February of 2022, when the Fed started raising rates. It's still extremely low by historical standards. What we're looking at more is that the economy created about 150,000 jobs in October. That's slightly below economists' expectations of 170,000. It's also below the average monthly gain of about 258,000 that we've been seeing over the past year, and considerably below last month's whopping jobs report, which even when it got revised down was a gain of 297,000. So certainly a slowing there, and we'll talk more about that as we get into it with our experts here. In terms of where we did see job growth, industries included healthcare, social assistance, and government. There was a decline in manufacturing that was largely attributed to the strike activity that we've been seeing there. But overall, kind of a lackluster jobs number today. So we'll dig into that. In terms of labor force participation, we're pretty much holding steady at 62.7%. Same thing with the employment to population ratio. That was flat at about 60.2%. Average hourly earnings increased again by 7%. 7 cents, from September to October. That's the same thing that we saw last month. Now we're at an annual growth of about 4.1% on an annualized rate. Last month, we saw wages were rising at about a 4.2%. The time before that, it was 4.3%. So as you can see, we're kind of, if we are hitting a soft landing, we're gradually coming into the runway there in terms of wage growth. So still, at least, though, seeing wages rising, and we'll think about how that compares with inflation, because in September, the CPI rose 3.7% on an annualized rate. That was a steady rate compared to what we had seen in August. And so workers are still, at least treading water. Their dollars are still going as far as they were before. One thing that was interesting was if you look at the job openings and labor turnover survey, so the JOLTS survey, we know that U.S. job openings increased in September, up about 56,000 to 9.5 million, with strong demand in accommodation and food services. But openings were dropping in the federal government, and there were fewer openings also in information and technology. And so there's definitely some unevenness there that maybe we'll unpack. The last thing that was interesting was that all small business, all of that growth was from small business companies. So companies that had 250 or more employees actually saw declines in their job openings, and layoffs were dropping as well. So we're seeing kind of some holding pattern. Maybe companies are hoarding workers, not going out and hiring as much, at least in the larger companies, and quitting has been down slightly back to sort of pre-pandemic levels. All right, so let's turn to our expert panel because we have them here so that we can dig into these numbers and think a little bit more Is this good for workers, bad for workers, or are they a mixed bag? So, Teresa, I'm going to turn to you first if you could give us your take on today's headline numbers.
Yeah, so I thought after the JOLTS numbers came out yesterday, Alicia, that this report was going to be a little boring. And I thought that wages would actually look a little flat. I was a little worried, and my worries were confirmed when I saw that what I call my take this job and shove it number, the job leaver rate and the quit rate has gone down. Both of those together, those numbers, really indicate kind of worker confidence that if they left their job, that they could find one that is just as good or a little bit better. We saw record numbers and kind of take that job and shove it, a couple of years ago. And I'd never seen anything like that in my career, which has been many decades. But it's slowing down. And that is consistent with kind of a flatness in earnings. And let me just take a minute to help people guide themselves through this number. So if you take a look at table B3, and those are the numbers that come from employers, we see that hourly rates are up in general in all these sectors. But what's really interesting is that hours of work per week are really fluctuating. So there are, in some industries like our, leisure and hospitality industry, people are getting actually hourly wage boosts, and they're getting more hours on their job. So their weekly wages are going up. And that's kind of interesting that their wages are going up and they're getting more hours. But in information technology, and those are the better jobs than in leisure. So if we look at this report in terms of what's happening to good jobs and what's happening to bad jobs, the bad news is that information, which is a high paid sector, the wages are flat, which are up a little bit, but weekly earnings, wages are flat, but weekly earnings are up, which says to me that there's kind of this intensity of labor, that the employers are not looking for more people in that sector, but the people they have, they're working a little bit harder. So when I have some time today to kind of suss out the numbers, I'm going to look at this kind of labor intensity. Where is that pressure? So that's what I saw today. And then one other thing I want to point out is that people on permanent layoff, a much bigger share of the unemployed than we saw before, which to me shows softening. And the last thing I want to say is, especially when looking yesterday, I'm really surprised that Biden and the Fed were able to avoid a recession. I don't think we're going to have one, and I think most of the economists don't think we're going to have one, and that is actually pretty remarkable. So, good news and bad news.
Yeah, that's been a big headline of late. Is economists walking back their doom and gloom from this time last year, the year before. I think, Justin Wolfers most famously on Twitter saying, "I told you all so," because he's been one of the few who was like, recession, what recession? Stop talking us into a recession. And so I agree. I think economists are finally all coming around as a group to consider the fact that maybe this plane's going to land without too much damage on the runway, which would be great. I really appreciate that deeper dive into thinking about the labor intensity, because it's certainly true. If hiring's slowing down, quits and layoffs are slowing down, but if the world keeps turning, then that means we're probably asking our workers to do a little bit more on the job. So that's a really interesting insight. Aaron, what were you seeing today below the headline numbers? I'm so curious to hear what you have in mind.
Yeah, I think that overall, looking at things together, it's a softening report. We see continued kind of deceleration. Last month had that big headline job growth number, but sort of everything else in the report last month was consistent with sort of deceleration and weakening. Like, I want to be really clear, though, we talk a lot about what's changing, and it's important to also know like where we are, like the level. And like the labor market is really strong. Like, we have very high employment rates. We have very low unemployment rates. So people are finding places to be productive in the economy, especially prime age workers. And but this month, so we've been at like a more than 20-year record high for prime age for 25 to 54-year-old workers. But this month we did, and last month we saw ticks down. So it's fallen by about 0.3 percentage points over the last couple months. But it's still it ties now the peak pre-pandemic, and it's before that back to like 2001 or something for so the labor market is very strong. There's a lot of productive activity happening. There's a lot of job opportunities. Layoffs are very low, or it's like still about 23% lower than right before the pandemic. So, which was a pretty strong and tight labor market too. So job security is kind of at a record high, very close to a record high. So yeah, we have seen hiring slow, and the hot heat is leaving the labor market, but it's still like very warm. It's still quite hot. Like it's not boiling over, but it's still quite hot.
Yeah, we'd like a warm and toasty labor market. That's totally fine, right? We don't need one on fire, which is, when
Right.
you're seeing job numbers like we had been of 250,000 a month, 300,000 a month, like that's a labor market on fire. And so I think, yeah, we'll take that, healthy range of 150, 170, 180,000 jobs a month. Like that's a well-functioning, healthy labor market, that we think is sustainable in the longer term. And you're right, sometimes economists, we pick apart these little changes month to month because we got to find something to talk about. But you're right, the levels of where we are at are quite remarkable. And even when you think about labor force participation for women in particular, we're back above pre-pandemic levels for labor force participation. And in particular for moms, we're above where we were before the pandemic, which is an amazing accomplishment given the setbacks that we saw early on in the pandemic for women. And in particular for women with children under the age of 5, we're at the highest labor force participation we've ever seen. So, it remains to be seen how that continues with, changes in policy related to the childcare subsidies ending and things like that. But, we should just take these wins while we have it and feel good. So I think that's kind of what you're saying. So let's, go beyond the headlines. The reason why we invite you guys on here, aside from the fact that I love seeing you every month, but is because you guys know a lot about the labor market. You always look deeper into the report, and you focus on different numbers and give us your insights from like kind of what's your specialty here within thinking about the labor market. So Teresa, I'm going to pop back over to you. What are you seeing below the headlines? What's your stat of the day? What's the thing you're going to take away and dig further into later on?
Yeah, well, I'm going to look at that intensity number and to see the kind of proportions of strength among the good job sector and the bad job sector. So I want to look deeper into sort of job quality, and then it takes me about a couple of days to really suss out what's happening to that older workforce. That older workforce is something that it really changed in a way that mothers' labor force participation changed about 15 years ago. And we were really looking at whether or not that group was going to come in and whether or not they were supported. I really want to draw our attention to the over 55. Not only is that where the growth is happening, just in terms of numbers because of the demographic changes, but because retirement security has been so weak. And the financial fragility of older workers have been, not getting stronger. That we see a lot of people in their 60s really trying to be attached to the labor market where they had not been before. They're a little more comfortable retiring. And research by Aaron's colleague Beth Truesdale and colleagues have shown that the security of employment for people between 50 and 60 is actually not as good as we thought, that only half of people in that age group have secure jobs, that they are fully employed, right the run up into, to retirement. So then I'm going to be looking at kind of the skill obsolescence, kind of
Mm.
the problems of that group. So that's where I'm going. Good and bad jobs, how that's faring, and what's happening to that group over 50, over 55.
I think that's a really important thing to consider too, is, there is a little unevenness here and there in the labor market. And then as the, work nature of work is shifting maybe from one industry to another, or evolving in terms of the way we do particular kinds of jobs, it involves either workers retraining and learning new skills, or, if not, then getting left behind, right? So I think that's a really important thing to look at. Aaron, what did you see below the headline numbers? What's your kind of takeaway stat of the day?
One that I was really interested to see is we have a really hard time. We have terrible statistics for tracking strikes and labor disputes, like in general. We did a much better job back in the 1890s tracking labor disputes. There, at that time, the commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics did reports that included records on every strike in the country that involved more than 5 workers. And for the last 30, 40 years, we've only tracked strikes if they involve over 1,000 workers. And so it's really hard to get a sense of what's happening with workers joining together to push for higher wages and better working conditions in the official statistics. There are a couple different sources, and one of them is released on Jobs Day every month. It doesn't get a lot of attention, but it's the Bureau of Labor Statistics estimates the number of employees who are absent from work due to a labor dispute. And this month we hit a 96,000, which is the UAW strikes, the actor strikes, and a few others, and that's the highest number since 1997. So in about 26 years, and so I think it really signals. It gives you a data point to understand the surge in labor activism, sort of workers feeling like it's hard for employers to hire. It's been hard for employers to hire. So the risk of going on strike goes down because it's harder for them to find somebody to replace you if they want to. And, if you do lose, so that makes the cost lower. And then on the other hand, corporate profit margins are really high and been high. So if you look compared to the pre-pandemic, the corporate profit margins are up 30%, while hourly compensation in the private sector is only up about 16%, I think. So a lot of workers see, look, it's hard. We have leverage. We can go out on strike with low risk to ourselves, and there's a big benefit to doing so because the companies, we're producing a lot of value for the companies, and there's value there to share. So the potential benefits are big. And, I think wages get pushed up through competition and also through sort of coordinated individual bargaining and collective bargaining. And so that I think that's an interesting stat, that we're at a 26-year record high for sort of labor conflict, which is disruptive and sort of lost output, but it's sometimes what needs to happen to shift the balance of the division of the value that's created through jobs.
Yeah,
it's a little bit just a little bit frustrating that these big corporations, I mean, one thing that Aaron talks about in his work is the growth of concentration, among employers, kind of monopsony power, has really been growing, and also their power in the product market. we fault the workers for going on strike, but the companies could have avoided it by agreeing to this kind of contract before 6 weeks were out. The same thing with the writers' strike and the actors' strike. So strikes are a little bit irrational, but it takes a lot for management to learn, and it takes a little bit of pain. So I suspect that they learned their lesson, and we may be seeing faster settlements.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
UPS was a good
Yes.
example this summer where management recognized that they had profits to share and that the Teamsters had legitimate issues with, lack of air conditioning in the trucks, with global warming. Like UPS drivers were dying of heat exposure on the job. And, they said, these are big issues. We need to find a way forward together. And they came to the table and they made a deal, and there was no disruption. The automakers, for some reason, didn't choose that strategy. I predicted a month ago, 6 weeks ago or so, that it would be a pretty quick strike because it was very clear that the management was beaten, like especially once Biden said he was going to show up on the picket lines. Their whole corporate strategy has been reoriented towards this EV transition, and they're, bought into the Chips and Science Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. Like there's a lot of federal partnership there. And it took them a couple extra weeks to figure it out, but
it's slow to learn.
Yeah. And I think that's a big difference. I think it's always been said that the most effective strike is the strike that doesn't happen, right? That's what we saw with Teamsters and UPS, where they got a historic deal with a $7.50 per hour raise over the length of the contract, and averted that nationwide walkout. And compare and contrast to what happened with the UAW. And Shawn Fain said a couple of days ago that this strike squeezed every last dime out of GM, right? And you got to think back, if you're an employer that's facing a potential strike at this point, you're probably going to get a better deal if you come to the table early than if you come to the table late, right? Because not only did they get an extra 33% pay increase for incumbent workers, but they also got other groups included in that deal for UAW. They got the battery workers included, those that do components. And in Shawn Fain's words, slammed the door on having a permanent underclass of temporary workers, right? They went all the way to the mat on this. And, so far in 2023, there have been 22 major work stoppages. So strikes, those are strikes that involved at least 1,000 workers. Those are not small. And I do think that this combination of coming out of the pandemic, where, Teresa had her take your job and shove it index at the highest level in decades, coupled with a strong labor market as we reopen the economy, has really given a boost to labor power. I mean, so we're still only about 10% unionized, which is, half of what it was 3 decades ago. But it'll be interesting to see where that goes in the future. All right. Speaking of the future, this is where you get your crystal ball out and tell us, what is your take on looking into the next 6 months to a year in terms of worker power? Do you think workers will continue to have the upper hand? Do you think we'll still see them able to get these potential wage gains out of large corporations that are sitting on record profits? Where do we think this is going? Aaron, I'm going to start with you this time.
I think there's 3 big factors that are supporting worker activism and organizing. I'll focus on that part. The politics of the administration are supportive, and there's an election coming up, in a year, and I think unions are going to be working hard to put economic issues on the agenda and organizing on the agenda. So I think there's going to be a lot of organizing, a lot of activism. If you get a big contract win, but you don't organize to support that and spread those standards, it means you're going to shrink and diminish. Also, like, the economy is tight. it's been weakening a bit, but again, it's still at a very strong level. So I think the conditions are not quite at peak, but they're still quite strong for workers to try to make gains. And then the third thing is that public opinion has shifted dramatically over the last 10 years. It used to be for decades that sort of people liked unions and liked big business the same. Like they went, affection for both went up and down with the business cycle. But after 2012, it really split. And like people started supporting unions a lot more. And we're kind of at record public opinion and support for unions. But support for big business just kept going down after the Great Recession. And so we're kind of at a record low of public support for big business. So in conflicts between workers and big company management, I think the public is much more strongly aligned with workers than any time in decades of data we have back to the 60s.
Yeah, I think when you see President Biden, right, standing with the picket line, which is a very stark contrast to Reagan, right, ordering all of the airline workers back to work, that's a complete 180 degree reversal in terms of sentiment and support. Teresa, what are you thinking? What do you see for the next 6 months to a year in terms of worker power?
So complimenting Aaron, I just want to be specific. He's right. You're right too, that corporations may not be enjoying public opinion, but they are enjoying a lot of corporate power. Corporations have become, they're more and more super firms and more profits. To that end, their ability to pay more to workers has only gone up. And so there's more room for profit sharing or rent sharing, as we call it. So I'm looking forward to this happening in certain sectors. So watch out for what's happening with the communication workers of America. They have a foothold in a place they have not had in ever. And that is with the new merger of Activision with Microsoft. There are some gamers and some game creators and coders that are now have a union contract, and that Silicon Valley, that tech sector had been union free except for the last couple of months. So I'm really looking forward to incursions of unions into those traditional sectors that are good jobs but have been union free. I'm going to be looking for unionization in Tesla and the Japanese transplants, because I think the big audience for the UAW and the president has been, watch out, you non-union employers, we might be coming for you. The same thing with the Teamsters in the trucking industries, the Amazon's new trucking and even FedEx, that look at workers in those industries are watching what's happening in UPS. Maybe they're ready to unionize. And I always, and I want to look at what's happening to these new chip plants that are being created in places like in Arizona, traditionally union free, but being created, in Maricopa County, where it's been moving to a higher education, more democratic state. Are those big public-private partnership manufacturing firms, are they going to be unionized? And then I always look to home health care. This is an industry that's vital for the well-being of our citizens, of our people, and this is where we have non-white workers, we're women, and that's what some of the worst and most important jobs. So I'm looking forward to unionization there.
Excellent. And, I'll just kind of round us out. And, one of the things that I'm looking to think a little bit more deeply about is kind of the track record, if you will, on unionization in terms of diversity, right? So when we think about worker power, I think we get to a real point of worker power when every group of worker has power, right? And so if you think about what your dad's union looked like 20 years ago, it was not very representative, right? In terms of gender, race, ethnicity. And so that's a little bit of what I'll be, carrying forward and thinking more deeply about is, are we bringing along all groups of workers when we're looking at this unionization movement. In particular, one of the stats that I'm looking at right now is I always keep an eye on labor force participation for women and unemployment rate for women. And that's been pretty steady, overall for all women in this report. But one thing that I noticed is that the unemployment rate for Black women ticked up from 4.5% to 5.3% at the same time their labor force participation increased. So I'm going to dig more into that number, but kind of reminding ourselves that there's, sometimes hidden groups of workers, invisible groups of workers who do not always get to be part of these labor movements. And so I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. All right, I'm going to bring the conversation to a close right there. I want to thank today's guests, Teresa and Aaron, for their expert insights and their continued excellent work. I also want to thank Asia Sims, our producer. And before you go, Seth would be very cross with me if I didn't remind you to subscribe to the Power at Work blog so we can keep you updated of all the great content we are producing. Thanks for watching. We will see you back on the blog again soon.